Minister, I'm Thomas Ice, and at my book table we have our monthly publication called Pre-Trib Perspectives by Tim LaHaye and myself, and you can pick up a free copy if you'd like as well. Also, we've got a special on our chart book that normally sells for, I think, $27 now. For $22, you can get that and the study guide that goes with it for $22. And that study guide retails for $8. This, we sang "I'll Fly Away" a while ago. I remember my church history professor, Dr. Hanna, used to say he liked to listen to country music because it makes him want to preach the gospel. And I told him, I said, well, you must not be able to understand the lyrics in rock and roll then. But I remember back when I was younger, they had this big wave of backmasking, messages, hidden messages if you play the records backwards, and you get hidden satanic messages. Well, in country music, if you play it backwards, you get your wife back, your pickup truck back, and your dog back. And so if that's not bad enough, we can cheer up because things are getting worse in the world, so it ought to make us really want to preach the gospel. But this morning I'm going to talk about the new anti-Semitism, why the world hates Israel, because I'm going to be talking about, I've already talked about the rapture of the church, which occurs before the 7-year tribulation, and then I'm going to be talking about the second coming. And so I wanted to set up my talk about the second coming to show why we have the second coming. Exactly in God's plan, why will the second coming occur? And the second coming relates to Israel. The second coming isn't just God says, okay, it's time to come back, and then I'll figure out what we're going to do. The second coming is to rescue the Jewish people that had he not returned at that point, and history would have been allowed to go on a little longer, the Jewish people would have been wiped out in history. So the second coming is a rescue event. And we see, even today, that this anti-Semitism in the world is building against Israel. And one time I had a discussion with a Christian who is an anti-prophecy guy, and he said, well, you never defined anti-Semitism. Well, I'm going to define it. It's the hatred or persecution of a Jew. And the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the mother of all dictionaries, says that anti-Semitism is the theory, action, or practice directed against the Jews. Hence, anti-Semite, one who is hostile or opposed to the Jews. In other words, hatred of a Jewish person simply because they're Jewish. Not necessarily for anything they've done wrong, but simply hatred for the Jews. Now, the new anti-Semitism, though rooted in past anti-Semitism, the new anti-Semitism targets not just the Jew as an individual, but Israel as a nation. So the new anti-Semitism is directed toward anti-Zionism or as anti-Israel. In other words, Zionism is the belief that the Jews have access or should be able to go back to their land. If you believe that, I do. I am a Christian Zionist. And I believe that because I believe the Bible teaches that. And there's a whole interesting history of how Christian Zionism started developing in the late 1500s on into the early 1600s with the rise of Puritanism. And today, 400 years later, we are considered the most dangerous people on the planet, according to Rosie O'Donnell. It's not the Muslim terrorists, it's Christians who support Israel because we enable Israel to exist. If we didn't support them, apparently they view us as a swing influence, then the rest of the world would be able to wipe Israel off the map. There's some truth to that. But nevertheless, we know that God has a plan for them just as he has for you and me as his children. And I forgot about the little X there. And in 1974, Foster and Epstein wrote a book called The New Anti-Semitism, once again documenting that in the past, Israel didn't have a nation. And so people hated the individual Jew. And they started documenting in this book about people hating the nation of Israel in the same way that people hated the individual Jew. And that was after the Six-Day War in 67 and Yom Kippur War in 73, when Israel's popularity, probably at least in the United States, reached a height. And it's been downhill ever since. And so we've seen recently, for example, the Gaza protest of people who have been out protesting all over the world against Israel's supposed persecution of those poor, innocent, ancient Palestinians who were founded in 1963 by Yasser Arafat. Yeah, Joan Peters demonstrated in her book from time immemorial that most of them had been there like 2 years before 1948. And of course, I'll never forget, on Israel National Radio a few years ago, I listened to the lecture from the 1950s by this Arab historian in the United Nations on why Arabs are not Palestinians in the 1950s. Because the Jews were Palestinians up until that point. And, that's a whole nother talk. But the Jerusalem Post on February 15th published this article talking about the Interparliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism is meeting today in London in wake of the Gaza campaign. While ignited an exponential eruption of global anti-Semitism frenzy unprecedented since the Nazi era, the intensity of the anti-Jewish rage, frequently accompanied by acts of violence, has engendered fear and anxiety among diaspora Jews. Excuse me. Obliged many to seriously ponder their long-term future. And so what they're saying is just this year is only 3 months old, we've seen some of the worst anti-Semitism since the 1930s, is what they're saying out there. And this article goes on and says, on every continent and virtually every city, enraged demonstrators have railed against Israel and indulged in anti-Semitic calls to boycott Jews, gas them, and dismantle the Nazi Israeli state. The anti-Jewish offensive, usually initiated by Arabs, have been supported by a wide spectrum of indigenous citizens. Jew baiting is especially intense in the UK. Here you're seeing footage from London. Prominent Jews encounter death threats. Students at Oxford University have gleefully proclaimed that in 5 years their campus will be a Jew-free zone. A high-ranking British diplomat was arrested after publicly launching a foul-mouthed anti-Semitic tirade. The London-based Royal Court Theatre is staging a viciously anti-Israel play by Carol Churchill that Melanie Phillips describes in The Spectator as reminiscent of anti-Semitic plays performed in the Middle Ages portraying Jews as demonic Christ killers. So Chuck Missler was talking about going back to the Middle Ages. Apparently we're going back to some other trends from the Middle Ages as well. In many European cities, Jews encounter violence in the streets. In Italy, a labor union has called for a boycott of all Jewish businesses. In France, synagogues have been attacked and cars belonging to Jews firebombed. A Swedish school has refused to accept Jewish students. A leading Norwegian TV entertainer, sufficiently insensitive to jokingly express regret for the billions of innocent lice killed with Jews in gas chambers. The Barcelona municipality canceled a Holocaust memorial because, quote, making a Jewish Holocaust ceremony while a Palestinian Holocaust was taking place was not right, unquote. Simultaneously, 300 Barcelonians marched in support of Hamas. Elsewhere, the deputy South African minister was obliged to apologize after making a railing statement against Jewish money that controlled America and Turkey in wake of the prime minister's historic outburst against Israel. Jewish institutions were vandalized and calls were made to boycott Jewish businesses. There were violent anti-Jewish riots at York University in Toronto, Canada. Even in the United States, where public opinion remains overwhelmingly supportive of Israel, the blatantly anti-Semitic demonstrations in major cities have shocked many American Jews, hitherto confident that, unlike in Europe, anti-Semitism would never reassert itself in their country. The increasing dominance of anti-Israel elements on most campuses provide additional grounds for concern because ultimately many of these youngsters will become leaders of the nation. And so we see this wave building, but it's not what it's going to be. And we see this interesting quote by Adolf Hitler, who said, "Gradually I began to hate them. For me, this was the time of the greatest spiritual upheaval I have ever gone through. I have ceased to be a weak-kneed cosmopolitan and have become an anti-Semite." So for Adolf, it was a process that built in his life, which eventually produced the Holocaust. And we see a building trend in our own day toward what the Bible talks about. And that is, Satan has a hatred for Israel. That's where it comes from. All racism is wrong. But anti-Semitism is a special class all by itself because it reflects the struggle between God himself and Satan himself. In fact, the Antichrist is clearly anti-Semitic, and he is also anti-Israel. In fact, if you look at the Schwarzenegger movies, nobody can beat up Arnold Schwarzenegger. But what do? Well, in one movie at least, they went after his wife and kids. And that's kind of the same thing what Satan is doing. He can't defeat God directly, as we see in the book of Revelation, but he goes after it. So after Israel and Christians as well. Usually when Jews are persecuted, true Bible-believing Christians are also persecuted as well. So anti-Semitism is caused by Satan himself, as we find a whole chapter talking about this in Revelation chapter 12. Now, the book of Revelation has over 650 allusions to the Old Testament. In fact, John is told to write down what he sees. He's not free to talk about anything, but he is writing down a vision that he is seeing. And I think John, in his old age, around 95 when the book of Revelation was written, was so immersed in the Old Testament prophets that when he saw the visions, and I think it's 24 times he said, "and I saw." So he's giving us a verbal description of the visions that he sees, that he uses allusions to the Old Testament prophet language from the Old Testament. And so this means that he takes and gives us a chronological sequence of the events that are going to happen after the rapture, starting in chapter 4. And he, by associating it with the Old Testament language, he gives us a basis for going back to these Old Testament allusions and seeing where those passages fit into the chronology of God's plan for the future in chapters 4 and following. And that's why the book of Revelation is the Bible's grand central station where everything comes together. It's the final piece in God's revelation that we need to know for these 2,000 years of church history as we anticipate what he is doing. And we see that chapter 12 of Revelation is considered the most symbolic chapter, has more symbols, they say, than any of the other chapters in this most symbolic book. And so today, the trend among evangelicals is that Revelation can't be understood. Even though the very name Revelation means to lift the blind or to reveal something. How many of y'all have grown up in churches, not this one, but others in the past, where the pastor tells you you can't understand the book of Revelation? That or you've heard that mentality all your life. Well, you can understand the book of Revelation. That's why God gave it to us, so that we can know these things. Now, you don't understand it by dropping a tab of LSD and hallucinating and have it going around the circle and asking everybody, well, how do you feel about this passage? You understand the book of Revelation by being an expert on the 65 books that came before it, because it is the Bible's grand central station, and so it takes perspiration, not inspiration, to understand the book of Revelation. And we will show you that as we go through this chapter, that the symbols can be interpreted to refer to either past or future historical antecedents or events. But the trend is to say that like for example, Hank Hennegraff's book, Charting the Apocalypse Code. We wrote a book against it back on the table called Breaking the Apocalypse Code, where he says that parts of chapter 12 have fantasy genre in it. Now, what is so-called fantasy genre? Fantasy genre is where you have a symbol like the dragon, who is not part of our everyday life. First of all, we don't know anything about dragons in everyday life, and we don't know anything about dragons with 7 heads and 10 horns. So that is a fantasy symbol that does not have a historical antecedent. In other words, it's not going to happen in history. So these are just ideas that talk about the general struggle between good and evil. And those know-it-alls who think that this refers to events that are going to happen in history, we're the bigots and the smarty pants or whatever, who think we can understand the book of Revelation, and we're the worst kinds of people that you can think of. Well, half of the symbols in the book of Revelation, which there's like 34 of them, the Bible itself tells you what they mean. It says the 7 stars are 7 angels. Duh. The 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. And it tells us that the dragon is Satan, the serpent of old. And if that's not good enough, it tells you again in Revelation 19. So you have to have a PhD from Harvard to be educated out of the plain and clear meaning of the text. You see what I'm saying? And so we can understand it, not that we don't struggle with certain passages, and it takes a long time to figure it out. But let's look at Revelation chapter 12, which is talking about the nation of Israel. And I saw, and a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And so here you have this picture that shows up. And what you have in Revelation chapter 12 is a chapter where in the middle of the tribulation you have the progress of the seal and trumpet judgments, I think, in the first half of the tribulation, and then a pause in chapters 10 through 15 to introduce you to the 7 key players that are going to be important in the second half of the tribulation. And so 4 or 5 of these are found in chapter 12, these key players. And here is number 1, the woman, which is Israel. But the historic interpretation of this has been that this refers to the church. And even the European Union, 12 stars in their flag comes from this very passage. On the internet, they'll tell you that the 12 stars come from Revelation chapter 12, the woman, but they won't tell you why. Most likely it's because they've adopted the Roman Catholic view that this represents Mary, and the 12 stars in some Catholic way is probably what the association is. But you have here insight into the struggle between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent all the way back to Genesis 15. And this is a thematic or topical overview of the angelic conflict that's going on behind the scenes in heaven with the angelic beings and all these other things that affect history on planet Earth. So some of the events that are being talked about here are past events that have already occurred, but in order to get the full picture of this angelic conflict as to why the woman is being persecuted by the dragon, you have to have the overview of the story to give a basis to give future prophecy, which it does as well, as to what's going to happen to the nation of Israel during this time. And so this is why the woman is clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, how do you know what that symbol refers to? Why can't it refer to the church? Well, if you go back to the book of Genesis, you see in chapter 37, verses 5 through 8, Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. So they already hated him. And he said to them, "Please listen to this dream which I've had, for behold, we're binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. Then my brothers said to him, 'Are you actually going to reign over us?' The answer is, yeah. It happened. You know, that little boy in something about the angels, it could happen. Well, it happened. Are you actually going to reign over us, or are you really going to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And what we find in the book of Genesis is 10 or 11 visions that occur in Genesis. This isn't the book of Revelation. This is Genesis, where you have visionary language. Now, today they say this is apocalyptic literature. And everybody knows apocalyptic literature can't be taken literally. How many of y'all know that? Well, first of all, the book of Revelation, I'll go with it. It twice says that it's a prophecy, not apocalyptic literature. And the reason they want to classify this as apocalyptic literature is so they can tell you that apocalyptic literature can't be taken literally. In other words, they want to override the historical, grammatical, or normal way of interpretation so that you will not be able to interpret it literally. So that they, the experts, who have all of this education, can tell you what this means. Well, sometimes the experts can be helpful, but a lot of times they just use their expertise to lead people astray. And if they classify this as apocalyptic literature, then what in the world why do you have visionary dreams in the book of Genesis? You telling me Genesis is apocalyptic? No, Genesis gives us the framework for interpreting visionary literature with symbols in it. Because in these 9 or 10 visions that you have in Genesis, every one of them has symbols just like in so-called apocalyptic literature. And every one of them is fulfilled within the lifetime of the person having the dream. So you see how they interpret these things early in Genesis. This is an illustration of what I'm telling you about simply knowing the rest of the Bible to interpret the book of Revelation, you see. Is that tells us in the first book of the Bible how we're to handle visionary language, you see. And these symbols are talking about, in this case, 12 sheaves that represent the 12 tribes of Israel. So there's a symbol that has a historical antecedent. I keep repeating that, don't I? but that means that it's going to happen in history. And so in this dream, his 11 brothers bowed down to him. And that happened in history. And then you go on. Now he had still another dream. You thought he was popular with his brothers. Now he's going to get really popular. Even mom and dad are going to turn against him. And related it to his brothers and said, Lo, I've had still another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Now in this vision, who are the sun, the moon, and the stars? And he related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him. So his father is Jacob, right? What is this dream that you've had? Shall I, Jacob, the sun, and your mother, the moon, either Rachel or Leah, and your brothers, they're the 11 stars, actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? And the answer is yes. Yep, that's it. Sorry. Doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. Doesn't matter if it's for you or not. It's going to happen. And so here you have this grouping of symbols, sun, moon, and stars, the only other place in the Bible, and it refers to Israel. Clearly refers to Israel. So we're letting Scripture interpret Scripture. And this is something that already happened in history, so we know what it means. And so when we come back to Revelation chapter 12, it's very clear, and other reasons that this refers to Israel is very clear. But you see, the replacement theologians and the other people, they believe God's finished with Israel, right? Israel has no future. So they don't want this to be about Israel because it's got a future for Israel. You see? But here in the book of Revelation, we can show it's the New Testament. They always say, well, show me in the New Testament where the Bible talks about Israel having a future. Well, here's Revelation chapter 12. Right here is where it is. And this cannot be the church, because the church was born out of the side of Christ. The church didn't give birth to the Messiah, the man-child, as we'll see here in a moment. Instead, it's the other way around. Israel gave birth to them. Mary specifically, but the nation of Israel gave birth to the Messiah. And twice the New Testament says that salvation is of or through the Jews. And so she was with child, so the woman's Israel, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. See, now, this is the birth that she's about to give is to the man-child, which will be a fulfillment of the prophecy of Genesis 3:15. The seed of the woman will crush the head of the seed of the serpent. And so it's a picture of, obviously this refers to the historical event 2,000 years ago, but at the same time it's picturing Israel in the tribulation, in travail. The birth pangs that Chuck Missler was talking about, which I think refer to the tribulation. We see in verses 3 through 4, and another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns. We've already talked about that. And in a few verses, it's going to tell us that the dragon is Satan, the serpent of old, the devil. Or I think it says that he's the devil first, and then the serpent of old. Okay. But it tells you who it is. And notice his posture is a confrontational posture. So we'll see that in a moment, where he's challenging the woman, waiting for the woman to give birth. And so this is that struggle that I was talking about. And what is the significance of 7 heads and 10 horns? Well, if you know the book of Daniel, you know it's talking about during the tribulation period, the 70th week of Daniel, is when Satan is going to inhabit a human antichrist so that his kingdom, Satan's kingdom, who will be behind this, will have 7 heads. In other words, it'll be made up of 7 rulers, and then 10 crowns. 10 horns are also rulers. So this is going to be the 10-nation confederacy. So it sets it in the context of the tribulation, you see. That's what this does. This 7-head, 10-horn monster that people say is a fantasy is going to actually be realized in history as the revived Roman Empire. And his 7 heads were 7 diadems for ruling or kingdoms. And so that's right out of the book of Daniel. And every symbol in the book of Daniel has a historical antecedent. Many of them have already been fulfilled. You have Daniel telling Nebuchadnezzar, "You are the head of gold." Wow. See, you've got Daniel interpreting the dream and the symbols for King Nebuchadnezzar. And then later in the book of Daniel, when Daniel's receiving the dreams, he's got this angel that he keeps asking, "What does this mean?" And they tell you a lot of times what the symbol means. You just got to be able to read and comprehend, English if you have an English translation or whatever. But most people, when they read the Bible, they don't read it like normal literature. Like you're reading along, you're trying to understand the news story in the newspaper. They read it and just glaze over somehow. And they don't think. It's like you're looking at modern art, reader response. How do you feel about this passage? Well, I always wish my teacher had called on me because I would have gone, you ask how I felt. Oh, what do I think? Oh, what do I think? Now, I can express thoughts with words most of the time, but how do I feel? See, that's what we're taught in the schools today. It doesn't matter what the text is saying, what it means. It's how we feel about the text. That's part of the dumbing down of people so they can't study the Bible properly. So then they come to, because they've been taught that in a public school or maybe even in a Christian school or whatever, how do you feel about? They have never learned to read and comprehend what something is saying. Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, what is it saying so that you can understand what is being said. And so here, his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And so here is where later on, it's going to tell us, it's going to repeat this very same phrase, but it's going to substitute the word stars and use the word angels. In the book of Revelation, you have stars when they either refer to physical stars or when they are used symbolically, and you have to decide from the context. Like any language, you decide from the context. Then it refers to angels, and it's very consistent. And this goes back to the book of Job. So it's supported by the Bible as a whole. And what we're seeing is he's reporting here in the early verses here the vision that he says, "And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth." And this is the confrontational posture that I was talking about. So that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. So who is her child? It's Jesus. It's a Messiah, the Jewish Messiah in this context. Why? Because Satan's goal in history, in fact, what was the first book in the canon of the Bible? Does anybody know? Job. It's the oldest book. Now, Genesis records things back before the time of Job, but it was written during the Exodus around 1400 BC. Job was written perhaps around the time of Abraham or, around there, 4,000 years ago. It's the oldest book in the Bible. And the book of Job I like to view as the prolegomena to Scripture. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is you have carried out in the life of an individual, Job, what history is going to be like. And Job has angelic conflict going on. Satan's picking a fight with him when he really didn't do anything wrong, just so that God could demonstrate something in history. And so, in the process, Satan says that God doesn't know what he's doing. God's not a good God. He doesn't know how to run this universe, and that Satan could do a better job. And one of the main purposes of history is to settle the angelic conflict, for God to demonstrate in history that God does know what he's doing, and Satan doesn't know what he's doing. And so all throughout the Scripture, the Bible pulls the curtain back and gives us a glimpse here and a glimpse there of what's going on up there in heaven. And as a result, it shows the impact that what's going on up there has down here on planet Earth. And here you have an illustration. Satan is part of what's called the angelic council, and occasionally God calls on the angelic council to help him rule history. And so Satan's goal in history is to interrupt God's plan in order to try to prove his charge that God doesn't know what he's doing and God's not capable of running the universe, you see. And so that's why, let's look at this. You have historical incidents of Satan's hostility toward the woman's seed. There's the famous prophecy in Genesis 3:15. And the first thing you have is Cain's murder of Abel. Why? Because in Genesis 4, what does Eve say when Cain is born, her firstborn? She says, "Behold, I have begotten a man-child," with the most translations have in italics, with the help of the Lord. And when you have words in italics, that means they're not in the original Hebrew or Greek, depending on whether it's Old or New Testament. And here, the phrase "with the help of" is not in the original. And so I think a better reading or understanding of that passage is to translate it, "Behold, I have begotten a man-child." And y'all remember diagramming in school? Or do they probably have creative diagramming now, if they have it? Where when you have an appositional statement, you're supposed to put equals. So I've begotten a man-child, and you'd put an equal, the Lord. She thinks her firstborn is the fulfillment of Genesis 3:15. She thinks that Cain is going to be the seed that crushes the seed of the serpent. Boy, was she disappointed. And mothers have been disappointed ever since in their sons. Well, that is part of the lesson in history. That's why we need redemption, and things. So Cain murders Abel instead of the opposite. You have the corrupting of the human seed through angelic human marriages. In other words, the sons of God, which are fallen angels that had sex with women and created the Nephilim, trying to corrupt the human race so that you could not pass the seed of the woman through. So God steps in with Noah and 8 who were not involved in that and destroys planet Earth and keeps people from doing that in the future. So that's the reason you have the flood. You have the attempted rapes of Sarah and Rebekah. Rebekah's plan to cheat Esau out of his birthright and the consequent enmity between Esau against Jacob. The murder of the male child in Egypt, where Moses was rescued from that. The attempted murders of David, the Lord's anointed. Queen Athaliah's attempt to destroy the royal seed. A little boy is 7 years old, hid away in the temple, and he is the last connection between the Messianic seed. And Queen Athaliah is trying to kill that little boy, but she didn't. And so the Messianic seed continues. You then have Haman's attempt to slaughter the Jews, to wipe them all out. You see, that is why you have anti-Semitism. Satan says, well, I'll just wipe all the Jews out, and that way you can't have a fulfillment of the prophecies because they depend on the Jews. And then you have the consistent attempts of the Israelites to murder their own children for false sacrificial purposes throughout the Old Testament. Herod's attack against the children of Bethlehem, so he goes in and tries to wipe out the Messiah. That's why the angel of the Lord comes in a vision and tells them to go to Egypt, and they're protected, and tells them he died, you can come back now. And that's why the wise men brought him gold, frankincense, and myrrh, so they have something to live on in Egypt, you see. And so God takes care of his son, the Messiah. Then you have many incidents throughout Jesus' earthly life, including his temptation that typify the ongoing attempt of the dragon to devour the woman's child once born. And so this is what I call the angelic conflict. The struggle between the seed of the woman. That's what this chapter is all about. And this tells us why Israel is so crucial to the tribulation period and why Satan focuses on her. And we're seeing that build up even now, where the whole world is turning against Israel. Even the United States is beginning with the change in our policy now. And so it says, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to his throne. There's the word rapture that I mentioned yesterday. Harpazo, he's caught up to his throne, and that, of course, is a reference to Acts chapter 1. But how do we know that this son is the Messiah? Because it says he rules the nations with a rod of iron. And in Revelation 1, that is said to be Jesus of Nazareth. So Revelation 1 applies Psalm 2, that he'll rule with a rod of iron, to Jesus of Nazareth, and it's repeated here in chapter 1. So it clearly identifies the man-child as Jesus of Nazareth. And the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she might be nourished for 1,260 days. Now, I think 1,260 days means 1,260 days. Just thought I'd tell you that. Because if you read all these commentaries, especially from the 1800 and before, it means 1,260 years. It could be all kinds of things, you see. It can almost mean everything other than 1,260 days. But 1,260 days, I think, is 1,260 days. So, this is 3.5 years, 42 months, as it says later on. Now, some call this, and I think it's a good definition, the second Exodus. And we see Christ referring to it in Matthew 24, where he says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Oh, you can understand? Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. So in other words, when they see this in the tribulation, the Jewish people are going to flee. Now, that raises a question. I thought why are the Jews going to listen to Jesus? Well, I think because in the previous chapter of chapter 12 of Revelation, chapter 11, you have the two witnesses, and they're killed right in the middle of the tribulation and resurrected and everything, and the earth dwellers rejoice and create a whole new holiday for this. But then it has this little statement, and some feared, the rest feared him and gave him glory. Who are the rest there? I think it's the Jewish people who were converted through the ministry of the two witnesses by this point. Why? So that they can be converted and then heed their new Messiah's words from Matthew 24 to flee. And so the remnant apparently is converted at this point, at least the Jews that live in Israel, so that they can flee to the wilderness. And he says, if you're plowing in the field, don't even get your stuff, your billfold laying on the side. Don't go in the house and gather a few things for the trip. Why? Because your number one priority is to get out of Dodge, as we would say where I'm from. Get out of town. Why? Because God is going to take care of you like he did during the Exodus with the children of Israel as they flee to Petra. Because the word nourished is used, a term right out of the Exodus for the giving of manna and water out of the rock and all that kind of stuff. And so God's going to take care of the Jewish remnant, probably in Petra, as you can see from the graphics that I have up here on the screen, which is where they're going to flee to. How many of y'all been to Petra? Some of y'all have, okay. It's a big place, isn't it? But you got to get through that little narrow thing there, unless they fly you in a helicopter or something, I guess. And he says, for then there will be a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall. And unless those days had been cut short, no life would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Now, the elect here in the context are talking about the Jewish remnant. How do we know? Because you see a lot of this language is quoted directly out of Daniel chapter 12. And in Daniel chapter 12, instead of this single term, the elect, that Christ uses, we have what you call in grammar a circumlocution, where you use a lot of words. In other words, instead of the elect that Jesus uses, Daniel says everyone whose name is found written in the book. So that's a bunch of words. Christ takes that same phrase, quotes the context before it, and takes that circumlocution out and simply uses the word the elect. And the context of Matthew 24 supports the idea that these are Jewish believers, as well as the context of Daniel chapter 12. So these are Jewish believers here that would have been wiped out if those days weren't cut short. Now, this is not saying that he's going to cut them short from 1,260 days to, say, 1,100 and something days. But it means that if the process were left to continue on its thing, let's say it would take 1,500 days or something, then they would be wiped out. So he's going to return at the 1,260 days to rescue them, you see, is what that, I think, is referring to. And we see in Isaiah 41 where he talks about how he's going to bring water out of the rock. And this is in the context of the future tribulation, just like he did in the days of the Exodus. And then you see Micah 2:12 that says, I will surely assemble all of you, Jacob, and I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. These are going to be the believing Jews in the tribulation. There's always been a remnant. There's a remnant today. How many of y'all know Jewish believers? I do. I probably know 25 or 30. They're part of the remnant. As Paul says, join together with us goyim, the Gentiles, to create the church. Now, once the church is gone, raptured out, God's going to be working through the Jews again. And the remnant is going to be the saved Jewish people here. And I will put them together like sheep in the fold. The Hebrew word for sheepfold is the word Basra. And there is a town near Petra called Basra in Jordan, southern Jordan, just across the river there. And this was the town apparently where they'll flee to, or nearby where they'll flee to. And around the time of Christ, the Edomians built the city of Petra. Nabateans, that's right. That's right. Well, I think it was both the Edomians and Nabateans, the Edomites, that is where that thing's located down there. The descendants of Edom, the red-haired guys. Like a flock in the midst of its pasture, they will be noisy with men. I've heard you can get 3 to 4 million people in Petra, so there'll be plenty of room for whoever needs to go there. Meanwhile, back at the ranch. there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. So back up in heaven, you got the war going on in heaven. See, God's going to clean up heaven, and then he's going to clean up earth as he brings in his kingdom. And God's not going to have just any old kind of kingdom. He's going to have a righteous kingdom. So that's why he has to destroy evil. And that's what the tribulation's all about. You know, I hear these people say, why does God allow evil in the world? And I say, because he's a patient, gracious guy is why. But what these people don't understand is if he decides to remove evil from the world, a lot of these people will be the first to go. But Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon, and I don't understand, why God just can go zap, and they're gone. But, there's a bunch of drama involved in this. And the dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer found a place for them in heaven. So where do they go? The great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan. See, there it tells you, whoop. And this is supposed to be some great mystery, fantasy genre and all that kind of stuff. Who deceives the whole world. 70 million Frenchmen can't be wrong, right? He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And so there you have the stars earlier were said to be thrown down, and now it's angels that were thrown down. So that tells us earlier that stars refer to angels. So that's how we know 1/3 of the angels fell. They didn't fall on this occasion. They fell at the beginning. And now they're finally being kicked out of the angelic council, as we'll see here in a moment. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. In other words, Christ won the victory at the cross, but he did not apply it until later in history. And here at this point is where he's going to apply it, and in relationship to the angelic realm, you see. And 3.5 years later, it's going to be applied to earth and in the human realm. And you say, well, why didn't God just go bang, bang, bang? In other words, he accomplished it. Why is he waiting? Because he's demonstrating certain things in history. You see? He's demonstrating to Satan, and the New Testament says to the angels, the elect angels, certain things. And he's showing that he is a righteous God and that he knows what he's doing. And history is a record of what he's doing. That's why I don't buy this idea that when we get to heaven, he's going to wipe out our memory of the earth and all of this stuff, because he says no more tears, and won't we be tearful for those that didn't make it to heaven. No. What he's going to do when we get our resurrection body is we're going to be mature people like God in that sense. We're not becoming God, but we're going to be mature, and we're going to be able to handle this knowledge. Because if he wiped out history, what'd be the point of history? The point of history is to be a record, a demonstration in time for us to remember and look back on and say, Jesus Christ is the hero of history, and God has glorified himself in history. So sure, we're going to know history when we get to heaven. But we're going to be mature enough to handle any things that might potentially be disappointments. And so here we have salvation, power, the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Christ have come, and the accuser of our brethren have been thrown down. So this shows you what Satan's doing in heaven. We see it in 1 John. He accuses us before God and says, that person doesn't belong, Joe Bell doesn't belong in heaven. He doesn't deserve to be a believer. And Jesus, the attorney, steps forward. That's why he's at the right hand interceding for the saints. He's not on the throne of David yet. He's got a law practice going on. And you get that real snide lawyer Satan up there, one of those real bad lawyer type guys who should be at the bottom of the ocean, type. And he's up there accusing believers all the time and saying, Joe Bell doesn't deserve that. And Christ steps forward as his defense attorney, and he doesn't even have to have a retainer or pay law fees. It's pro bono, it's for free. And he steps forward and defends Joe and says, on the basis of the blood that I shed, he has a right relationship and deserves to have a relationship with him. And he does the same for you and me, because y'all know what stinker I am. And you might have an idea about yourself as well. And so now he's no longer able to do this. But it says before that, he accuses them before our God day and night. This guy doesn't give up. Then it goes on and says, they, that's the saints, overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. In other words, the basis of their relationship with God, of overcoming these charges that Satan makes in the angelic council court in heaven, is the basis of Christ's death on the cross. It's not on the basis of having a religious experience. It's not on the basis of going to church. It's not on the basis of doing good. It's the basis of the blood of the Lamb. The very thing that they want to throw out of Christianity is the very basis that we are saved on. And secondly, our testimony. In other words, we have appropriated Christ's death on the cross. As believers, we can testify that it's what he has done on our behalf that has done this. And that is why we are able to stand before God righteous one day. And they did not love their life even to death. In other words, they lived the life as believers during the tribulation. For this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. So I did this paper on the earth dweller. Chuck Missler, I think, made a mention to it, of the 11 times that it's used. And here's the one time that the term heaven dwellers is used in the book of Revelation. To refer to believers juxtaposed with the earth dwellers, who are the persistent believers throughout the tribulation. And it says, woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you having great wrath, knowing that he only has a short time. Even today, when you have a criminal who's been on a crime spree, and he goes in some building or house, and the police say, come out, we got you surrounded. Do they just say, okay, you win, and they come on out? No. What do? They stay in there, and they want to take out and kill as many people before they take them. That's the nature of evil. Satan says, oh, okay, God, you win. I give up. He doesn't do that. Instead, what does he do? He is energized by the fact that he only has a short time. He becomes even more active and vigorous because he wants to take down as many people with him as he can. If I'm going to go to hell, I'm going to take as many people with me as I can. And so he's invigorated. And then we see, verse 13, and when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. See, why is that stated that way? The woman is Israel. This tells us why you have anti-Semitism. It's satanic. It's part of the angelic conflict. It's part of the struggle between God and Satan. It's going to come to a head in the tribulation. And we see it building already in our own day. People are practicing their hatred for the Jews today. They're getting real good at it. But, he says, who gave birth to the male child. In other words, he's showing that the fulfillment of the seed of the woman has been accomplished in spite of all the obstructions that are laid in the way. And so then we see, verse 14, the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman in order that she might fly into the wilderness to a place where she was nourished for a time and half a time from the presence of certain. In other words, another 3.5 years. And so this is not the Israeli Air Force and the American Air Force. It's a figure of speech that's used in the Exodus to talk about God's supernatural deliverance in Exodus 19:4, and we also see in Deuteronomy 32:10 through 11 that this idiom is used for supernatural deliverance. And then we see verse 15, the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. And I think this is also an idiom for military pursuit. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. So this is either an earthquake that swallows them up, like in a similar way to Pharaoh being swallowed by, and his soldiers in the ocean, or it's just an idiom saying that the earth hides them from this military pursuit. And then finally we see in verse 17, the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring. It has to be Jewish believers, the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So they can't find the remnant there from Israel. So he goes and makes war with the rest of Jewish believers at this point. And so next talk, I'm going to show you how this all ends. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the fact that you do have a plan for history and you are working even today. And the Bible does give us a glimpse of the angelic world and what's happening up there. And we know, even though we can't figure out in detail how it all works out, that there are things going on that impact our lives. But if we follow your word, stay true to you and your word, that we know that you will take care of us through Jesus Christ. And we just thank you that you've given us this wonderful hope in him. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.